All right, today we're going to talk about water. Water has some very, very unique characteristics that make it different than almost any other molecule on the planet, or in the universe, really. Scientists think that for there to be life on a planet, there has to be water, and some of it has to do with its unique properties that we're going to learn about today. Okay, what we're looking at here is something most of you are probably familiar with. It's a water molecule. Remember that water is H2O. So there's two hydrogens, the red dots, and one oxygen. Oxygen has it has 8 protons. So it has 8 electrons. The first 2 electrons go in the first shell. You see those 2 small dots. And then it has 6 electrons in its outermost shell. Remember that it has to have 8 electrons in its outermost shell to be stable, and so it's missing 2, so it's hungry for 2 more electrons. So it chooses to share its 2 unpaired electrons with the 2 hydrogen atoms and their electrons, so that now if you count how many electrons there are in the outermost shell of oxygen, it is stable. We're going to find out in the next slide, though, that it doesn't share those electrons evenly. Okay, water has a bent shape to it. Notice that the hydrogens aren't directly across from each other, they're bent down toward the bottom. Part of that is because oxygen shares the electrons unevenly. Those bonds, instead of being just called regular covalent bonds, they're called polar covalent bonds. A polar covalent bond is leads to a covalent molecule that has a slight positive and a slight negative charge on opposite ends. So notice the arrow on the right side that has a continuum, and there's a slight negative and a slight positive. That's a polar covalent molecule due to polar covalent bonds. In a polar covalent bond, one atom is more electronegative than the other. Well, what does electronegative mean? Electronegativity is the tendency for an atom to attract electrons. Basically, I like to imagine it as oxygen is a little bit stronger than hydrogen. So oxygen hogs the electrons more than its fair share of the time. So because electrons are negatively charged and the oxygen is holding those electrons more than 50% of the time, it's giving the oxygen a slight negative charge instead of a neutral charge. Vice versa, the hydrogen atoms, because they're weaker, they're letting go of those electrons. They don't hold those electrons as tightly, so their protons are sort of taking over, and that means they have a slightly positive charge. That positive and negative charge, that slight positive and negative charge, is absolutely crucial to all the other characteristics that water has that makes it so different than any other molecule. Okay, because water has a slightly negative charge on the oxygen and a slightly positive charge on the hydrogen, they're actually attracted to one another. Water molecules are attracted to one another. We refer to those bonds as hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds are very weak polar covalent bonds, or due to very weak polar covalent bonds, and they form rapidly and break rapidly. So everywhere on this diagram where you see a dotted line, that's called a hydrogen bond. It's a bond between, in this case, an oxygen that has a slight negative charge and a hydrogen, hence the name hydrogen bond, that has a slight positive charge. They break and form very, very fast, but they give water a unique strength. Imagine any time when you've belly flopped in the water. You hit the water with such force, it hurts, your stomach hurts. That's because of those hydrogen bonds. But then you don't stay on top of the water, you immediately sink into the water. That's because the bonds break so easily. So even though they're weak, when you have gazillions of them and you hit them hard in a belly flop, they have a very important force, and that hurts. But then they immediately break and you sink into the water. So the example of hydrogen bonds is between water molecules, and hydrogen bonding explains some of these unique properties of water. Cohesion and adhesion, we're going to learn what those are. It's high heat capacity. That means its ability to take in heat without boiling too fast. Evaporative cooling, how when it evaporates it cools down. The low density of ice, the fact that ice floats. The ability of water to dissolve many substances. All of those properties are due to this wacky hydrogen bonding, the fact that the oxygen is attracted to the hydrogen, so water is attracted to itself, but very weakly. Okay, one of water's unique properties has to do with its ability to dissolve other substances. That's what's referred to as its solubility. Because water is polar, it is attracted to other polar molecules. Examples of other polar molecules include sugars. That's why when you make your Kool-Aid, the sugar dissolves. It's because the polar um, the polar covalent charges in a water molecule attract it to the sugars. Other ionic compounds like salt, of course, salt dissolves in water, and some proteins are even able to dissolve in water. However, it is not attracted to what are called nonpolar substances, substances that don't have charges, either a slight charge or a complete negative or positive charge. Examples are fats. In the diagram or in the photograph below, you've probably all seen when you pour oil into water, oil and water don't mix, and that's because oil is nonpolar. It doesn't have any charges, and water is attracted to substances that have polar charges. Okay, another unique property of water is its ability to bead, these beads that you see on this leaf. That's called cohesion. Cohesion is the attraction of molecules from the same substance to one another. This is water molecules being attracted to one another, just like we said with hydrogen bonding. Because they attract each other, they pull in, and that's what forms a bead. Instead of laying flat on the leaf, you see them beading up, and that's because they're attracted to one another. It leads to surface tension and water droplets. Now, a similar property to cohesion is called adhesion. Cohesion was the attraction of molecules that are the same. I use the prefix co and I think of like co-workers. Co-workers have the same job, so cohesion is the attraction of the same molecules to each other. Adhesion is the attraction between molecules of different substances. So for example, the attraction of glass to water. Maybe some of you have had that experience at the doctor's office where they prick your finger and they draw a tiny little drop of blood, and then they hold one of these skinny glass tubes up to that drop of blood, and the blood shoots up the tube, and there's no plunger, nobody's sucking it up, it just shoots up the tube. The reason it does that is because of adhesion. The water in your blood is attracted to the polar molecules of the glass, and they climb up the glass tube. That has a name in and of itself. It's called capillarity. Capillarity is the attraction that causes the surface of the liquid to rise when in contact with a solid. So you can see in the photograph these different diameter tubes. The water climbs up different diameters. The water is attracted to the glass itself, and it pulls up. Because it's also attracted to each other, to the other water molecules, it lifts its neighbors as it tries to creep up the water and creep up the wall of the glass. It can only creep up so high though before gravity starts to hold it down. Unfortunately, I don't think most students ever ask themselves this question, but trees are absolutely incredible. Large trees are moving swimming pools worth of water up from the ground, up high, but they don't have a heart and they don't have muscles. They have no way specifically of lifting water, and yet water gets sucked in by the roots and travels up to the tops of the leaves where it evaporates. And the question is, how does that happen? So the question says, did you ever wonder how water moves from roots to leaves when a tree doesn't have a heart to pump the water? You probably haven't ever wondered it, but you got to know that's a really cool thing that can happen, and science doesn't entirely understand it to this day. We have some ideas. This is called the cohesion-adhesion theory. The idea is that as water evaporates from the leaves, the water molecule that's evaporating away is tugging on the water molecule next to it. That's those hydrogen bonds. It's attracted to the one next to it. So when it gains enough energy from the sun to be able to leave through evaporation, it pulls just slightly on the water molecule next to it. Cohesion and adhesion then pull the water up and replace the missing water molecules. So each water molecule tugs on the next one and the next one and the next one until you make it all the way down to the roots. It's as though they're all holding hands, and one person at the top yanks, and all the group gets yanked up toward the top. It's a little bit insufficient of an answer, because we know that gravity pulls that water back down again. And the question is, how does water, that much water, get that high in a tree? But that's the basic theory right now, that as it's evaporating from the leaves, it's pulling the molecules up from below. Okay, this is weird, but I got interrupted and now I had to move to Caribou Coffee, so now there's a lot of noise behind me, so my apologies for the background noise. I'll continue with what we were talking about. One of the interesting properties of ice is its density. Most solids are more dense than their liquids, and that makes them sink. But ice is just the opposite. Ice is actually less dense than liquid water, so it causes things like icebergs to float instead of sinking to the bottom. That is due to due to, again, the hydrogen bonds. And that's important to life because if bodies of water freeze, they freeze top down. If ice sank, the ice would sink to the bottom of a lake, for example, and then the top layer of water would be susceptible to freezing, and then it would sink, and then the top layer would sink and sink until eventually the lake would freeze from the bottom up. But the way it is now, the top layer of water freezes and the ice floats on top, and there's water available down beneath for the fish and life that are in the lakes to survive. And since scientists think life began in the oceans, that's an important property, that life can continue to survive even when there's ice. All right, unfortunately, we end this lecture on what is probably the hardest topic that has to do with water, and that's the pH scale. The pH scale is a scale that lets us know how acidic or basic a substance is. And you can see the scale on the right-hand side. It runs from 0 or 1 to 14. The lower numbers are acids and the higher numbers are bases. 7 is neutral. So look at the number 7, the green number 7, it says pure water. That's neutral. And then anything that's a lower number, it's moving up on the scale, getting closer to red. Those are the acids. So for example, where it says 1.5 to 2.0 in the red, that's gastric acid. That's your stomach acid. On the other end, in the blue spectrum, are things like ammonia and bleach. Those are bases. So the question is, where does the pH scale come from, and what determines whether something is an acid or a base? Actually, let me say one other thing. You may remember from junior high science that acids taste sour. So things like citric acid, orange juice, for example, is an acid. Your stomach acid is an acid. And that bases have a bitter taste and a slippery feel. So if you think about how bleaches feel, bleach feels slippery on your fingers. So now back to what causes something to be an acid or a base. The pH scale is simply a measurement of the concentration of hydrogen ions, and right now that's meaningless to you. What you need to understand is that water is made up of 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, but sometimes water breaks apart into 1 hydrogen ion all by itself and then a hydroxide ion, which is O and H. So instead of being H2O, it is H and OH. The more H's there are, the more acidic something is. The more OH's there are, the more basic something is. So let's define an acid here. An acid has a high concentration of hydrogen, also known as hydronium ions, and a low concentration of these hydroxide ions. A base is exactly the opposite. It has a high concentration of hydroxide and low concentration of hydrogen ions. So the pH is the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on that, but the hydrogen ion concentration is measured in a power of 10, and it is always a negative number. So it might be something like 10 to the negative 7. If you remember, a log is that exponent 10 to the negative 7. Negative 7 is the log of 10 to the negative 7. And when you take the negative log of 10 to the negative 7, you get 7. So that's the concentration of water. So something that has the hydrogen concentration 10 to the negative 2, its pH would be 2. And something that has a hydrogen ion concentration of 10 to the negative 13, its pH would be 13. So the lower number it has, the more acidic it has. The higher number it has, the more basic it is. And I guess that's it.